so much. I get the undeniable urge when I'm up here to bow or curtsy in some form. This is such a great venue. So I'd like to say once again, thanks so much to the organizers for having me. It's an incredible privilege for me to be here. I'm a marine science student from South Africa at Rhodes University, but I'm funded and supported by the National Research Foundation, and I'm a doctoral fellow at the South African Environmental Observation Network. Now, I said I was a marine science student, but I have almost an unhealthy obsession with science communication, unhealthy according to my supervisors. But they are kind enough to allow me to pursue these interests. So just to give you a very, very brief overview of what I'll be covering today. As a warning, all of the cool and interesting stuff is going to come at the end, so I'm going to try and rush through the beginning, which will be easy since my heart is moving quite quickly. And we'll get right on and start with, what is science communication? Now, we've answered this question many ways and by many different people, and I'm sure even if after yesterday I asked each of you for a definition of what science communication is, I might get a different answer for every person in the room. But if you ask Google, it gives you a very basic definition, and the most important thing about this basic definition are a few of the words that they use, and that is public communication to non-experts. Makes it sound easy and simple, right? But as we've said before, it's not enough to simply communicate. Your communication must be effective, and it must be intentional. This is incredibly important because we are living in a time when the world is changing. Not only is the world changing, but it's changing rapidly, and it's changing at very large scales. And so the other thing that is changing is our access to information. We are being inundated with a constant stream of input. And so the onus of effective communication is not on the receiver. The onus of effective and intentional communication is on the giver. So it's important to remember that. I believe that in order to cut through this constant stream of input, this constant stream of data that we all face, there are three things that all communicators should know. The first one is that human behavior shapes the world in many ways, on many levels, and at many scales. This is important because we can pay attention to this behavior, we can observe, we can try to understand, and then ultimately we can try and change that. Secondly, I think it's very important to know and to realize that media shapes perception. We need to reach out, and it was mentioned yesterday very well, to members of the media in order to engage so that we can change the way that they portray and thus shape perception of the general public. The last thing is, unfortunately, this is true, but humans are easily misguided. And we actually don't need to look any further than excellent propaganda to know how easy it can be to convince someone to join the dark side. So, even though you've heard it might be dangerous and hard to go online, you've decided to take the plunge. And all of us that have spoken yesterday and today, we've convinced you to Facebook and tweet and go online. So the first thing I think you should do if you'd like to go online is you should think about why. What is your reason for going online? What is your purpose? There could be a myriad of reasons. We've already discussed some of them, and there's so many out there that we could in fact make a game out of it that I like to call reason bingo. Pick a square. Might be in your contract, might be a requirement of your funding agency. Maybe you're out there to fight misinformation, or you study really cool copepods. Who wouldn't want to tell the world about that, right? So it's important to examine your reason because it determines how you communicate. It determines how you move along a communication pathway, and moving along a communication pathway helps you to then build a network with other people that have a similar purpose. And don't forget, I love Star Wars. Don't go online for the wrong reason, because fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate, as I said, can lead to the dark side. Again, proving my point of how easily humans are misguided. So these communication pathways that we follow and that create networks between people are quite easily captured on many social network platforms. It's easy to look at them. It starts with one person who communicates with or at or to another. That pathway leads to the next person, and it creates a connection. Our networks grow, they build on each other. We even have peripheral connections on the outer edges of the network. But why is this important? What does it change about how you reach out to people? Well, if you examine the connections between these, it will determine how you can move information through the network. What if you're in trouble? You're Han Solo and you need some help. Your immediate network of friends is all poised to help you. But if you don't examine the friends of your friends, you might end up choosing the wrong person. So examining these peripheral edges of the network and how connected they are to you can direct your information along the correct pathway. Remember that on the outer edges of your networks, people might not have exactly the same purpose. So back to marine science examples. What you can do is you can actually take hashtags and you can add hashtags to information that you put out online. So you can use these hashtags as bait or hooks because you attach them to the information that you're sending out. Every single online platform can actually curate all of these hashtags into one place. And then you can research that and look at all of the people that are talking about these specific topics. So hashtags act as vehicles or markers of information, and you can follow their pathway through communication networks. So I was interested in 3 hashtags, but for the purposes of today's discussion, what I'll be showing you is what a network of people that all use the hashtag marine science looks like. So this is the fun stuff. Looking at Twitter networks and procrastinating working on my PhD, still very important though, I came across this program called NodeXL. You may or may not be familiar with it. It's a very simple but robust and strong Excel plugin. It's free. You can download it. It's quite easy to use. There's a wealth of information and many, many examples. I would definitely recommend buying the book. I used it for about a year before I actually got the book myself. So buy the book first if you think it might be something that you use. But before we go through how NodeXL works and what it can show us, I'd like to introduce you to a little bit of the network terminology. So within a network, each individual user or Twitter account, because we're looking at Twitter networks, is called a vertex, also known as a node. The connections between those vertices are called edges. And then within the network itself, you can actually create smaller groups or clusters, and those groups have connections. So here you see a set of vertices connected by edges and forming a cluster. NodeXL, as I said, is a robust data program, so it can also produce a lot of information for you and give you ready-made metrics that you can then learn, so that you can then use to learn more about your network. So NodeXL will tell you how many people, how many vertices are in your network. It will tell you how many edges or connections exist between those people. And it will also then further tell you how many groups, smaller groups, exist within the larger network itself. But the most important thing, and the best thing, and the coolest thing that NodeXL does, or that I think it does, is it visually lays out the network for you. It gives you a really great picture, a good image of what the network itself looks like. And you can visualize your network then at multiple levels. You can look at an individual user, you can look at a cluster or a group, or you can look at the whole network itself. It's extremely appealing, and as I mentioned, it makes wonderful visual impact. But your burning question is, who tweets about marine science anyway? As it turns out, on the specific day that I collected this data, and I did this over a period of time, but I won't be presenting everything, unfortunately, not that many people. So out of over 500 million Twitter users, during the week that I collected this data, only about 300 of those were actually tweeting about marine science. So this tells us that it's not a hashtag that's used very often. And if we actually look at the words that these specific Twitter users use to describe themselves, you'll see that the words marine and science and education and PhD and university, those come up a lot. So it seems to be that not many people are tweeting about marine science, this specific hashtag, and that the people who are doing that are mostly marine scientists themselves. But NodeXcel also gives us other data. So along with the hashtag that I was interested in, it tells you what other hashtags people are using. You can then take this information, you can add these hashtags to your tweets, and that will further broaden your communication network. It helps you to direct the information that you're trying to get out there. You can also look at who the network talks about the most. So you can actually have NodeXcel tell you who is the most replied to or the most mentioned within a network. And then it will also tell you who the top tweeters are, who produces the most tweets. And I would say, just because you produce the most tweets doesn't mean you produce the most quality tweets. So remember, it's not always about quantity, it's really about quality. But the cool bit, as I said, is the visualization. So I have here for you a network of the 300 plus people that were tweeting about marine science. What I've done is I've sorted it into colors by location. So all of the same colors are in the same location. And then I've sized each vertex or node, that's an individual user, by the number of followers. So large nodes have lots of followers, smaller nodes have fewer followers, and you can track the edges or the connections between those. You can overlay the names. That looks very overwhelming, so I usually choose not to do that, but you can overlay the names on top of that graph. You can then take that network, and NodeXcel very kindly runs a great algorithm based on a very complicated paper that I have with me if you'd like to read it. But it sorts your network into groups, and it looks for commonalities within your network to create smaller clusters. So you can then zoom in on those smaller clusters, as we're going to do now, and it tells you how many pieces there are in those smaller components. So you do that in order to examine the relationships, the edges or the connections between the vertices. And in that way, you determine the level of influence that each user has on the cluster and then overall on the network itself. So looking at our largest cluster of 26 users there, we'll look at the biggest account, which is the Plymouth University account. I've pulled it out. And you can see that even though they have the most followers, they only have 3 connections within that smaller cluster. I call those kinds of accounts hubs. They're usually doorways of information, but they might not have as many connections. Secondly, we'll look at what I call an influencer. This is a smaller account, but it has many, many more connections, much more influence in the network. So identifying these users, targeting them, sending your information through them means that you broaden your network itself. You can also look at this graph on the level of a sub-user. NodeXcel kicks all of this out for you, and depending on how fast your computer is, it might take a long time or not. But a very quick comparison. This is our marine science network. This is the ecosystem services hashtag network. It's larger, there's more connections. If I put it there, you can more easily see the difference between the two. But the winner is climate change. So this is data that I collected. It's 1 week of Twitter data. That's 15,000 plus Twitter users tweeting about climate change. It looks overwhelming at first, but again, NodeXL has this great power to even take a very, very large network and find groups and clusters within that network. You then examine the groups, you look at the connections, you look at the levels of influence, and you study the relationships. Somebody yesterday mentioned Google Trends. I'll very quickly mention it as well, because my favorite thing about Google Trends is downloading the CSV file, plugging it into R, and then using it to forecast how a hashtag will be used in the future. So you can take years of data and years of a search term and forecast that into the future, and then determine, well, is this worth my while, or what do I think will happen? So, in summary, I use something called the RAPID method. I made that up. You review, assess, plan, implement, and then direct. I'm a scientist by training. I like to do things in what I consider to be a very logical manner. So don't lose these powers of observation that you have. Don't stop looking for tools that can give you more information about how not to just communicate better, but to communicate effectively and intentionally. And lastly, I would just like to say, again, thank you so much for having me. But I want to say that, you know, I come from a part of the world that is sometimes quite overlooked. And regardless of how much communication we put out there, if we don't as well do our part to lift up the marginalized parts of society, we will never accomplish what we want. So, thanks.